It's April 15th here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with the stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with possible auto tariff exemptions by U.S. President Donald Trump. Trump says he's considering a modification to his 25% tariffs on the auto industry to give car makers more time to relocate production. The rival parties of South Korea set rules to choose their presidential candidates for the June 3rd snap election, but only to clash over the way the rules are implemented. Blue Origin's all-female crew, including pop star Katy Perry and 5 other women, completed their space trip on Monday, with the mission marking the first female space flight in over 6 decades. The Trump administration could be easing its trade pressures some more as automakers and tech giants push back on looming tariffs. Our Moon Hae-ryang leads us this morning.
U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled another wave of temporary tariff suspensions, this time for the auto industry. Speaking to reporters on Monday, he said that he was looking to help car companies with potential pushbacks on his 25% tariffs on complete vehicle and parts imports.
I'm looking at something to help some of the car companies where they're switching to parts that were made in Canada, Mexico, and other places, and they need a little bit of time because they're going to make them here, but they need a little bit of time.
He did not specify when this pause would be implemented and nor how long automakers would be granted relief. Levies on fully built vehicles took effect on April 3rd, and those on parts are due to be implemented in stages no later than May 3rd, prompting automakers to lobby for exclusions over the past few weeks. Shares of U.S. car companies, including General Motors and Ford Motor Company, peaked following his comments, reflecting investor optimism that the administration may be softening its stance, at least temporarily, to cushion the impact of trade tensions on vehicle manufacturers. Trump also mentioned that he had spoken to Tim Cook, the head of Apple, and helped him and that whole business. On Friday, the Trump administration granted exemptions for popular consumer electronics from weighting tariffs on Chinese products and the baseline tariff on imports from other countries, stating that these products would instead be levied based on its national security investigation on semiconductors. Amid these shifts in trade policy, the U.S. stock market has seen fluctuations, and following these exemptions, Wall Street showed gains on Monday. The Dow Jones and S&P 500 both ended around 0.8% higher than the previous session, while the tech-heavy Nasdaq rose more than 0.6%. Moon Hae-ryang, Arirang News.
And Chinese President Xi Jinping, who has chosen to confront the U.S. head-on over Trump's tariffs, is now turning to Southeast Asian countries who have been hit just as hard as China to look for stronger ties on trade and supply chains. Lee Seung-ja has more.
Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived at Hanoi International Airport on Monday to begin his 2-day visit to Vietnam. The trip to the communist nation comes just days after U.S. President Donald Trump announced that he's pausing reciprocal tariffs on most countries for 90 days, while focusing his trade war on China. During his visit, Xi called on Vietnam to join China in upholding multilateral trade and countering Washington's tariff policies. Xi also signed dozens of cooperation agreements with Vietnam after holding talks with To Lam, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam Central Committee. While the contents of the agreement have not yet been released, Xi's visit also comes as Vietnam has been tightening controls on some trade with China to make sure products exported to the U.S. with a Made in Vietnam label have sufficient added value after pressure from Washington. In order to bypass U.S. tariffs against Chinese goods, Beijing would ship products to Vietnam before they are exported to the U.S. as Made in Vietnam products. The Chinese leader will also visit Malaysia and Cambodia from Tuesday to Friday. The two countries have seen increased trade and investment with China in recent years. However, it's also worth noting that Vietnam and Cambodia were among the highest hit by Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariffs, set at 46% and 49% respectively. As the U.S. and China exchange tariff after tariff, Southeast Asian nations are growing increasingly anxious about being caught in the mix. 이승재, Arirang News.
The Trump administration is launching probes that could lay the groundwork for tariffs on semiconductor and pharmaceutical imports. On Monday, the U.S. Commerce Department announced it had initiated national security probes into the import of semiconductors, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, pharmaceuticals, and pharmaceutical ingredients. While the timeline remains uncertain, the investigations are legally required to conclude within 270 days. The move marks the latest effort to bolster domestic manufacturing, as Trump continues to criticize America's reliance on foreign-made medicine and its dependence on chips from Asian countries. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said on Monday that trade negotiations with South Korea could take place next week. In an interview with Bloomberg TV, Bessent said the U.S. held talks with Vietnam last week, with Japan scheduled for Wednesday, and South Korea penciled in for next week. He added that negotiations will proceed quickly. The Wall Street Journal also reported on Monday that the Trump administration is prioritizing negotiations with South Korea, the UK, Australia, India, and Japan. And as far as Industry Minister An Duk-gun could visit the U.S. as early as next week for negotiations with Washington. There, he is expected to seek an exemption from the sweeping U.S. reciprocal tariffs. So Trump's hinted tariff relief is indeed good news for many, but it's also important to read behind Trump's tariff formula. For that, we turn to Professor Greg Butchek this morning. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So Trump is now considering pausing his auto tariffs. Now, where is this flexibility coming from?
Sure. So, I mean, at the outset, I just want to say I'm going to do my best to answer these questions as if there's a master plan behind this. As you know, there's a lot of flux. It's not super clear to me that there really is a master plan, but I'll do my best to offer a justification for the current state of play.
Please
so
do.
Auto tariffs. One of Trump's stated goals is to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. By the way, the U.S. is already a major manufacturer. They're a sort of second largest manufacturer globally. The U.S. makes about 18% of global manufacturing by value. China's about 25 to 30%. And the U.S. tends to manufacture sort of specialized high value add things like airplanes, electronics, pharmaceuticals, medical equipment. And Trump wants more auto manufacturing in the U.S. Again, we already do a lot of that. We have Tesla, Kia, and Hyundai, for example, have large auto plants in the southern U.S. Trump wants more. And the thinking is that by raising tariffs on auto imports, that will make U.S. auto manufacturing more competitive domestically. So the transition is really difficult. You can't just snap your fingers and magically have a car factory materialize. You need to build the factories, you need to build out the supply chains. And I think the thinking here is like, let's give Ford or GM and so on some time to make that adjustment and bring supply chains domestically.
Right, it could be a months-long or years-long project for the U.S. to, produce cars solely. Now, the good news is that Trump says it'll prioritize its allies, including us, South Korea, when it comes to tariff negotiations. Now, will that be any helpful in any way for us, South Korea, or not as much? What do you think?
Sure. So, one of the other big tariff justification out there besides bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. is sort of a national security justification. And basically that is the U.S., but also pretty much everybody is currently very dependent on China for certain critical parts of the supply chain. So, for example, rare earth elements that are critical in electronics and batteries. And kind of the worry is that this dependence on China for critical materials kind of ties everybody's hands in how they can respond if China makes aggressive claims on the South China Sea, if China invades Taiwan, if they try to extract various concessions from neighbors like South Korea or Japan. So, the idea is by reducing reliance on China, that will allow for a stronger response. By the way, I think this is, sort of the best justification for tariffs. There's not a great economic argument for them, but there is some reasonable trade-off where we just decide to make ourselves a bit economically poorer in exchange for greater security. Are tariffs the best way to do that? I personally don't think so. I would prefer another way, but at least it's something. So the purpose here is to build global resilience against China as a sole provider of certain items. It makes sense to build this coalition of allies where inside the alliance there are low or minimal tariffs. By the way, this was kind of the idea behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was an agreement negotiated by the Obama administration and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton back in 2016. That was ready to go, but Trump killed it. Now maybe we're back to some version of that, and maybe better late than never. So is it good for South Korea? You know, on one hand, other things equal, lower tariffs with the United States is good for Korea. On the other hand, this is likely going to be offered in exchange for something else. So crackdowns on Chinese transshipments, weapon systems based in Korea, for example. Whether the deal that Trump offers ends up being worth it for Korea, I'm not exactly sure, and I think we'll have to see how negotiations go.
Right, both sides have to play smart here. Now, Trump also signaled a flexibility on iPhones and not just cars. The question is, where is this generosity coming from? Is it to help Apple just only?
Yeah, this one's a little harder for me to justify. I think this sort of high-end electronics manufacturing like this is exactly what they wanted to bring back to the US, and exempting this seems counter to that goal. My best guess here is, you know, Tim Cook went to President Trump and said it'll cost $3,000 to make an iPhone in California. And voters are going to hate that, so you better exempt them. And Trump really responded to that. I think kind of a lot of what we see in this tariff saga has kind of had the flavor of Trump will do a blanket tariff, and then individual companies will come to him in exchange for exemptions, and presumably in exchange for some favors to Trump.
Right, he is going to have to look after the consumers in the U.S. Now, China is also looking to survive through Trump's reckless tariff pressure. Now, isn't President Xi on his trip to Vietnam? He is in Southeast Asia. What is he trying to do there?
So I think two things are going on there. One, as I mentioned, to some extent, both Trump and Xi are sort of in doing some coalition building. You know, Trump is trying to build his allies, Xi is trying to build his allies, and say to them, no, don't make a deal with Trump, join our camp here. The second thing is a big issue with tariffs that came up earlier in the report, is they're sort of easy to get around through what are called transshipments, which just means, you know, you build the thing in China, you ship it to Vietnam, maybe you put new packaging on it, but you don't really do any value add to the item, and then you ship it to the US. And if you do that, if there's sort of high tariffs coming out of China, but low tariffs coming out of Vietnam, that's a way to sort of bypass the tariffs, and that activity is pretty hard to monitor, for the US to monitor without some Vietnamese cooperation. And so the US kind of wants Vietnam to crack down on that, China clearly doesn't. Now, like, what is in Vietnam's interest here? It's kind of an interesting question. So on one hand, you know, they're certainly enriched by engaging in this transshipment business. You know, they can collect some fees on goods that pass through the country. On the other hand, Vietnam also wants their own domestic manufacturing sector to grow and be healthy. And that will be more competitive if they clamp down on these transshipments from China and sell their own domestically manufactured goods to the US. So what I think is going on here is both sides, the US and China, are sort of trying to convince Vietnam who's going to be the better partner. Do they want this sort of transshipments through China, or do they want to work on their own domestic manufacturing sectors?
Right. Well, last but not least, the U.S. has also begun national security probes into chips and pharmaceutical imports now. How much information and what kind of data does the government collect for the president to adjust imports to the U.S. and make a final call there?
Sure. So I think narrowly answering the national security question is kind of easy. So why is this important? A lot of Trump's authority to impose tariffs without the consent of Congress and the Senate, which would normally have to okay this stuff, comes through a section of our trade law in a subsection called Section 232. And it basically allows the president the authority to impose tariffs on things for national security reasons. So at a basic level, doing this legally and in a way that will withstand congressional or court challenges requires some kind of national security justification, and they're after that. Whatever you think about tariffs, I think it's a pretty easy argument to make that semiconductors and pharmaceuticals are of national security interest. Semiconductors are key components of modern weapon systems. They're important in sort of the nationwide infrastructure. And then on the other hand, if you run out of antibiotics or antivirals in the middle of a war or pandemic, clearly that has national security implications. I think like the needle they need to thread here is, how do you tariff semiconductors that go into cruise missiles, which makes a lot of sense, while exempting the semiconductors that go into iPhones, so iPhones don't cost $3,000. And sort of threading that needle is what I think they're going to be thinking about over the next 270 days or perhaps a little shorter.
All right, Professor Butchuk, thank you so much for connecting with us this morning. You enjoy your evening there.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
We are now counting down less than 50 days to the early presidential election. Rival parties have now set their own primary rules, but with little consensus. Our Kim Do-yeon has the details.
South Korea's major political parties are gearing up for their presidential primaries, but controversy is brewing for both sides, with candidates dropping out. The Democratic Party of Korea has previously announced rules for the competition. 50% eligible DP members and the other 50 by an open survey were the issue. In the past two presidential primaries, anyone who signed up in advance could participate in the voting, regardless of party membership history. This is why Kim Do-gan said it's against tradition and the party's spirit, and dropped out of the race on Monday. Kim Dong-yeon also said the rules aren't fair, but accepted the changes. DP's election committee on Monday brushed off the claims and started its first meeting.
The early election needs to be an answer to the call of those who fill the streets. The committee will be fairer, transparent, and more stable than ever for this primary.
Despite the controversy, a new high-profile participant entered the race on Sunday, former Gyeongsangnam-do Governor Kim Kyung-soo. As for the rules, he accepted them. But the DP's frontrunner Lee Jae-myung didn't comment on them. He continued to promote his candidacy by visiting an AI chips company on Monday, pledging 100 trillion won, or around $73 billion of investment into AI industries. Meanwhile, the People Power Party's official registration started on Monday, with the deadline set for Tuesday.
I know it's tough times, but I ask good candidates to come forward. Our party's primary principle is clear. All candidates will be at the same starting point and under the same standards.
However, the issues seen with this rival party were seen in the PPP as well. Its tactical voting prevention measures, asking respondents for the party they support during open survey and excluding those who support opposition, were the problem, with some saying that to expand support, this measure has to be scrapped. However, the rules stuck, and former lawmaker Yoo Seung-min said he will not be joining the PPP primary in protest. In addition, Seoul Mayor Oh Se-won also declared that he is not joining the PPP primary, but didn't specifically mention that the decision came in protest of the rules. On Monday, however, Hong Jun-pyo, the latest Daegu mayor, joined the race as he had previously announced. He focused on the need to beat DP's Lee Jae-myung and that he's the only candidate who was able to compete with Lee. Now the public waits to see if the candidates who dropped out will still run as independents. With such a short election season, this could have impacts on both parties. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The first hearing in the criminal trial of former President Yoon Suk-yeol took place on Monday. There, he defended himself and reiterated his long claim that the December martial law order was non-violent. Shin Ha-young reports.
Former President Yoon Suk-yeol denied charges of insurrection at the first hearing of his criminal trial on Monday. During the hearing, prosecutors pointed to Yoon's actions leading up to his martial law declaration, claiming he aimed to undermine the constitutional order to foment a coup. Yoon pushed back, claiming the martial law declaration was intended as a peaceful message to the public and not a coup d'etat. His legal team asked the court to dismiss the case, arguing that the indictment was unlawful. It brought up the issue of the detention period, stating the indictment was filed after it had expired. Two key witnesses, including Cho Sung-hyun from the Army's Capital Defense Command, testified at the hearing. Cho said he was ordered to send troops to remove lawmakers from the National Assembly on the night of the martial law order, repeating his earlier testimony given at the Constitutional Court in February. Yoon arrived at the Seoul Central District Court on Monday morning as he is required to attend the trial in person. This comes 10 days after he was removed from office. The court did not allow media filming in the courtroom, explaining that the request came in too late for the appropriate judicial procedures to be followed. However, it added that if the request is submitted again for the next hearing, the court would review it. To convict Yoon of insurrection, prosecutors must prove that he intentionally tried to undermine the constitutional order by using the military. If convicted, he could face life imprisonment or even the death penalty. The next hearing is scheduled for next Monday. 신하영, 아리랑 뉴스.
Now, let's take a look at some stories from around the world with our Choi Ji-hee. Good morning, Ji-hee.
Good morning, Dami.
So, Ji-hee, let's begin with the historic spaceflight by Blue Origin and completing its first all-female crewed mission since 1963.
Sure. Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin rocket carrying pop star Katy Perry and 5 other accomplished women safely returned to Earth after reaching space. The Blue Origin New Shepard rocket, developed for space tourism, successfully returned to Earth on Monday with an all-women crew of 6 women after an approximately 10-minute flight to space.
Taking up space!
And for me, like Gail said, this wasn't a ride, it wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and it was a supernatural one.
The crew took off from Blue Origin's launch site in West Texas at 9:31 a.m. on Monday. The 6-person crew included pop star Katy Perry, journalist Gayle King, aerospace engineer Aisha Bowe, civil rights activist Amanda Nguyen, film producer Carrie Ann Flynn, and pilot Lauren Sanchez. The flight lasted about 10 minutes and 21 seconds, reaching the Kármán line, the recognized boundary of space where the crew experienced moments of weightlessness before safely returning to Earth. The mission marked the first all-female spaceflight since Valentina Tereshkova's solo journey into space in 1963. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump hosted El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele, reinforcing their alliance on immigration enforcement amid controversy over deportations. In a meeting at the Oval Office on Monday local time, President Trump and President Bukele discussed their ongoing cooperation on immigration policies. The discussions came in the wake of a Maryland resident mistakenly being deported to El Salvador's terrorism confinement center, despite a U.S. court order preventing his removal. Both leaders have declined to facilitate his return, with Bukele stating he lacks the authority to smuggle a terrorist back into the United States, and Trump officials asserting that the responsibility lies with El Salvador. Also during the meeting, President Trump praised President Bukele's efforts in combating gang violence and suggested the possibility of expanding deportations to include U.S. citizens with criminal backgrounds. The United States and Iran are set to hold a second round of nuclear negotiations in Rome on Saturday to follow discussions in Oman, which both sides described as positive and constructive. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani confirmed on Monday that Rome will host the upcoming negotiations after requests from both parties and mediator Oman. The first round of talks in Muscat with U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi marked the first direct discussions after years of indirect communication between the two states. A landmark antitrust trial against U.S. tech giant Meta Platforms kicked off on Monday in Washington, D.C. The Federal Trade Commission is seeking to force the tech giant to break Instagram and WhatsApp off from Meta. It alleges that the tech giant bought the platforms in a strategic move to eliminate competition and establish a monopoly in the social networking market. CEO Mark Zuckerberg defended the company's actions, saying the acquisitions enhanced consumer experience, citing competition from platforms like TikTok and YouTube. The trial is expected to span approximately 8 weeks and could result in potential structural changes for Meta.
It's hard to believe we're in mid-April. I mean, it was another very chilly start here in Seoul with the wind chill. And we'll see temperatures start to climb as the day goes on, but it is still going to feel cooler than usual for this time of the year. Meanwhile, some of the upper inner regions, including Paju and Chuncheon, saw sub-zero morning temperatures this morning, but readings will rise fast along with plenty of sunshine. So as you could tell, the last few days of the wet sprinkle snap help to ease the dryness in the air and clear the dust. The only concern today in terms of weather is some chilly spring conditions. Seoul gets up to 14 degrees Celsius. Daegu, Gyeongju, Busan will be topping out at 17 degrees under clear skies and decent air quality. The good news is that temperatures will generally be on the rise for the next few days, but we'll have those significant temperature swings between day and night. So please definitely keep that outer layer handy to stay comfortable during the cooler mornings and evenings.
That wraps up our morning edition of Arirang News. Thank you for watching.